welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, part of the Aerospace Corporation. I'm excited to introduce this next episode to you. I've dubbed it the Leadership Show, and we're talking about enabling the in-space economy of the future. It's a three-parter covering cislunar, including the moon, and activities in low Earth orbit, or LEO. The guests include CEOs from Voyager Technologies and Varda Space Industries. Both companies are doing real things in space today, and they're looking to advance for tomorrow. We also have the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, dual-hatted as Director of Office of Space Commerce. So, how do these leaders envision the in-space economy unfolding? What feels different now than any other time in the history of commercial space activities? What is industry looking for from government to unleash the business of in-space activities while maintaining both coordination and competition? And finally, what is government doing to enable that and continue building on the mass capitalization that we see today? We hear directly from Department of Commerce on that. So don't forget, all of our shows are on YouTube and available by podcast. The Center's deep research papers on topics from across the space sector are all at csps.aerospace.org. So let's go over to the chairman and CEO of Voyager Technologies, Dylan Taylor. He's talking to the Director of Civil and Commercial Policy here at CSPS, Dr. Brian Weeden, about the lunar and cislunar economy from his perspective. Brian?
Thank you, Colleen. Dylan, it's great to see you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be with you.
Well, I know you're well known in certain parts of the space industry, but if you could just briefly start by introducing yourself and your company and what your role is in our ecosystem.
Yeah, sure. So Voyager, publicly traded space and technology company on the New York Stock Exchange. We went public in June of 2025. We were founded roughly 7 years ago. We're notable for a couple of reasons. We're working on a commercial space station project called Starlab. We're also the largest commercial user of the International Space Station today. That's the legacy Nanoracks business. We also do a lot as it pertains to picks and shovels, laser comm terminals, star trackers, power and propulsion systems for satellites and the like. And then we also have a large national security and defense business as well. So my background is in running public companies. I've done that most of my career, but always lifelong passionate space advocate. Got involved in the industry probably about 15 years ago as an early stage investor. Done a couple other things. I founded Space for Humanity that you might know. And Brian, I think you and I had some interaction on that. And that's a nonprofit that's dedicated to democratizing access to space and sending people to space. And at Voyager, I serve as chairman and CEO of the company. And we're based in Denver. And so that's a little bit about what we're up to. And of course, it's all about infrastructure, which I know we'll get to, but that's really what Voyager is focused on.
Well, and that's fascinating. You and Voyager has such a broad interaction with different parts of the space economy and, from suppliers to doing your own things and activities. That's kind of what we want to talk about today, right? Mm-hmm. And I'll start by saying, where do you see the in-space economy going in 20 years from now, particularly if we start thinking about extending from what we're doing in Earth orbit out towards cislunar and lunar space?
Right. Well, we think of it in terms of we call them the 3 L's, Brian, which I think you'll appreciate. First L being LEO, low Earth orbit, of course. And I think that'll be more about commercialization of LEO via commercial space stations, satellite constellations, and the like. And then, of course, the second L being lunar, right? There's a big push into lunar. We have our key initiative on that as well, which we can talk more about. But I think that's going to be a big policy focus for certainly the Trump administration and presumably beyond that as well. And then the third L, many people don't necessarily associate this with the next step, but we call it Lagrangian, which for those of you who are not space buffs or experts necessarily, Lagrangian points are these stable orbits. There's 5 of them. Think of it as kind of a permanent orbit that won't degrade over time. L2, for example, has the James Webb Telescope in it, about 1 million miles from Earth, roughly. So we see Lagrangian as the next step past lunar. That's really a proving ground for deep space, and that's ultimately what's going to open the gates for destinations like Mars, the asteroid belt and things like that. So the three L's: Lagrangian, lunar, and Leo.
That's a pretty expansive vision. As you and the company thinks about that, do you primarily think about it in terms of technology or economics or governance or culture or all of those? Is there a particular focus that you think kind of draws all that together?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, Brian, because I think that is actually what we need to be more thoughtful of. And when I say we, I mean the industry. So I think one approach that's been super successful recently is vertical integration, right? SpaceX has just completely crushed vertical integration. I'm not against vertical integration, but I don't think you can commercialize Leo. I don't think you can commercialize lunar. I don't think you can make it to Mars without broad partnerships, not only coalitions internationally, but broad partnerships between different types of companies from different industries. So I see a massive opportunity for what I call convergence, which are really different technologies, different industries flying in formation around policy, around standards, around vision, but really working together, for these greater aims. I don't think it's realistic to say we can vertically integrate, the equivalent of, Asimov's Foundation Corporation, if you will, and pull off these civilization level changes under a single company. I just don't think that's practical, not only for regulatory and other reasons, but even capitalization. Like even SpaceX at presumably 1.75 trillion won't have all the capital they need to do all the things that we're talking about long term, right? So I think it's really important that you partner. It's really important that there are policy frameworks that we can all, as I said, fly in formation around. I believe in international collaboration. I know that's a little bit out of vogue right now, um, for whatever reason, but I actually think that this is a human endeavor. And ultimately, we've got to make sure that international cooperation is at a maximum. And, I've talked about this before, but I think we are developing two different distinct ecosystems: the Chinese-led ecosystem, the Western-led ecosystem. But there's a big, broad middle ground there that haven't picked their lane yet. And I think it's really important that we have a compelling ecosystem that the people, whether it's the Gulf states or South America or Turkey or India, that they're gravitating, no pun intended, towards our ecosystem.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that international point and a little bit here, but I want to return to kind of, I think what you said was when we talk about a space economy or space market, a market is not just one or two companies or even one or two customers. It is I think ideally it's a diverse range of many companies, many buyers, many sellers, right? That's what I learned in my basic economics class. That's what makes a real market and kind of brings those market forces about. And I think that's what you're getting at, right? That's sort of, if we're trying to build an economy, that's where you think we really need to be aiming for, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's well said, Ryan. I think it's a marketplace. But then also, I want to make sure I emphasize this point. It's just not space companies, right? It's technology companies, or earthbound companies in general, resource companies that are all converging for these large, take data centers in space, right? That's a hot topic right now. That is definitely going to be a convergence of a lot of different, industries to ultimately enable that. Same thing with lunar commercial development, right? But yes, it's a marketplace, but it's also a convergence of different industries, is the way I see it being successful.
Yeah, and I think that gets to this question of, we often or sometimes we think of the space economy as something separate and distinct from the Earth
Mhm.
economy, where
Right.
I think the point you just made, oral data centers, for example, they're going to be using terrestrially made components and chips and all sorts of things, and hopefully connecting back down to terrestrial systems and economy, right? So I think you're also sort of hinting at that point is maybe yes, space is important, but it's not an independent thing necessarily, right? It's about how the broader part of the Earth economy.
Totally, totally. And I think of it as a domain, right? I've talked to a group of global CEOs at World Economic Forum and other venues, and I've told them, I said, you're all in the space industry. You just don't know it yet. Because think of the space uh, domain as a domain, right? We don't talk about the China industry, right? China is a domain. It's a sphere of commerce. It's the same thing with space. And so all these industries are going to have a space strategy or be impacted by the space-based assets, right? So I think of it that way. And then I think of, I've said this before, but I like the way it lands, which is think of the moon as the eighth continent. Um, and think of it as an opportunity for commerce, but think of it as a frontier. Think of it as an Antarctica, if you will. By the way, that brings up a whole issue around policy, right? Do we have the Antarctica treaty model, or do we have the free for all Wild West model for governance, right? Which I think is a really important question to be asked. But yeah, I think of space as a domain. I think of all industries being impacted by it, and I think of the moon as the eighth continent. I really do.
People in the space community have been talking about the space economy for decades, and you and I, we've been around long enough. We've seen some of those things come and go. What is different about now that you think makes it more realistic that we might actually be able to make some of these visions come true? And first of all, is it different now? And is it the technology? Is it the economics? Is it the policy? Is there something there that makes now different?
Yes, it is different. I think that the number one enabler is heavy lift rocket capability, Brian. Now that we have not only reusable, reliable, inexpensive launch, it's also high cadence, right? I mean, we're launching humanity is every 36 hours or so. That was unheard of, even 5 years ago. Even for the most bull case, we weren't envisioning launching every 36 months. And this is pre-Starship. So once Starship's online, New Glenn's online, it's only going to get more dramatic. So I think heavy lift rocket for sure. I think capitalization. We're going to have the largest IPO in the history of the world, presumably SpaceX here in the next couple months. I don't think we could have obviously had something that meaningful 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago. So the fact that we're going to have this gigantic capital event that's really centered around the space industry. I get that there's AI involved and there's other parts of the story that are attracting capital to that offering. But fundamentally, it's a space company, right? SpaceX is fundamentally a space company. So I think between heavy lift rocket capability and capital, I think those two things have never been, more dramatic in terms of its impact on the industry. So, and then there are other things. I think technology maturing, material sciences. That was my undergraduate degree, was materials engineering. So I know a little bit about this, and just the advances in material science in the last 36 months are just extraordinary. So I think a lot of these technologies are starting to mature, and that's further enabling these, science fiction-y ideas to be more practical.
So, you know, looking at this vision for where you think the space economy is going to be in the next 10 years, going out to, you said, going from low Earth orbit to lunar and out to Lagrangian. Let's talk a little bit about what it's going to take to get there. And I want to start by talking about, you mentioned policy several times. The governments under the current legal framework are responsible for enabling, authorizing, and supervising space activities, but also play a strong role in providing kind of the frameworks within all this activity to take place and creating sort of economic systems. Are there any current sticking points you see in the existing framework for space activities, oversight, governance that you think we need to get past in order to really see these goals, this vision come to fruition?
It's a very thoughtful question, Brian. I mean, I think certainly space traffic management, I think, is a key thing, right? Because we're going to have more activity. This also brings up things like debris and our ability to do conjunction analysis, making sure that we have clean orbits and things like that. So I think all that is being looked at, but I think there's still some work to do. I think lunar is still a very open question right now in terms of, if you were to have a helium-3 mining company, and land a lunar on the moon, are you entitled to those resources, right? What's the framework? If there's a dispute, a contract dispute, what's the governing, what policy, prevails? What convening jurisdiction, has jurisdiction over the issue? So I think a lot of these issues need to be worked out. I know there are a lot of thought leaders putting a lot of thought into this, and there are a lot of working groups talking about it. But I do think this is an area where U.S. policy could provide some leadership here. The good news is I think people are recognizing that. I think the conversations are happening. And we have a space caucus now as you probably know. We actually, I think, now have a human spaceflight caucus, I understand. I think Space for Humanity had something to do with that. George Whitesides, who I know former chief of staff at NASA, is very much involved in these issues. And there are other people in Congress who are involved in these issues. So I think we're getting smarter. We meaning the US and policy makers in general are getting smarter about what the topics are. So I don't have any, dramatic concerns saying if we don't get this fixed immediately, we're not going to be able to move forward. But I do think there are some structural issues that we're going to have to address. But I am confident those are at least being discussed right now.
So you're in talking about the governance frameworks. You mentioned earlier in the conversation that obviously not just the United States that's involved in space, it's other countries as well. How much do you think there needs to be a focus on the US putting in place the right frameworks versus how we engage with other countries and that international framework?
Yeah, it's a very thoughtful question. I think we need to provide leadership here, Brian. I really do, because I think if we don't, I'm not sure it's going to happen necessarily. I mean, there are other, organizations looking at policy issues like the World Economic Forum, the UN Committee on Outer Space Affairs, and others. But I think it's really a U.S. policy opportunity here, and I think people are looking at this. I mentioned George Whitesides and others in Congress, I think, are smart about these issues. And I think there's an opportunity for us to create a framework here. And I think if we create a framework, we can get alignment from international partners. Again, with the China issue, they're going to have their own approach. How we reconcile our approach and China's approach, I think, is going to be a central question. But I think that's true here on Earth, right, on terra firma as well. I think there are a lot of parts of the world where Chinese policy and U.S. policy are not in sync, and we're going to have to reconcile the same in space.
To me, that is one of the big questions that I'm not sure we have a great handle on it. I think you're right. If we do end up having two or maybe even more frameworks, or at least philosophies on this, I think that makes it a lot harder to do the kind of integration that you were talking about earlier in the conversation. I'll say I personally am not sure just how different those frameworks may be. I look at some of the comments that have been made by the Chinese delegation, others in places like COPUOS where they're discussing space resources, and at least on the surface and publicly, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of difference there. And if you look at what Chinese government companies plan to do in space, they're planning to do a lot of the same resource extraction, lunar ice, all the things we're talking about. So part of me wonders if they're going to do the same things, does that mean they're having the same approach? But I don't know, right? So I think that is one of the fundamental questions we are grappling with is, are we all on the same page, or are we going to have competing ideas and visions?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, it's things like property rights. Like presumably China's aligned on that, but I mean, I think that's an open question. The second is what happens in a dispute, right? I think that's kind of the second central question. But one other thing that I'm hopeful of, and this is where I think industry can provide a leadership role, are standards, right? So if we focus on what are some of the international standards that matter for space-based infrastructure, and get corporations around the world to align around those. I'm not talking about technology transfer. I'm not talking about ITAR. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about base standards. Think of it as the docking adapter on the International Space Station. I think those kinds of things could provide a bridge where we're reducing the friction for different parts of the world to work together on space-based infrastructure. And the policy almost kind of falls out of that a bit. because then it becomes like we want to protect our interests as opposed to, we have to create this framework to actually have an interest. So I think standards are underappreciated for being gateways to creating alignment globally.
and and maybe underappreciated in how the role in other parts of our world, right? When we were talking
Mhm.
about transportation earlier, how much of the maritime transportation world is enabled by the standardization of the cargo container, right? And what
Right.
that does for that whole system. And in the space world, each satellite is kind of still a unique butterfly in terms of being mated to a satellite. So we're not quite there yet. But that, to me, that's
Yeah.
something that sticks out as one of the things that we might want to think about, or could be a great enabler for the space stuff.
Sure. I
Yeah.
mean, think a Wi-Fi protocol. If you went to a hotel in Brazil and you needed a special router or something, right? So there's lots of examples of that, Brian. And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, is figuring out what those opportunities are for global standards. And I think that can create a lot of forward momentum for collaboration.
Building on that, we talked a little about sort of the governance policy framework. Are there any technical challenges you see to getting to this vision? We talked about how the rocket transportation piece has come a very long ways. Are there other pieces of technology or things that you think really are going to be critical to figure out the next few years to get to that 20-year vision?
I do. I would say lunar power. That's the number one impediment, I think, to achieving lunar objectives at scale. We have to have enough power. And I know, NASA's looking at things like nuclear, which they absolutely should. Persistent polar solar is being looked at. But I think we've got to solve some of these transmission issues, let's say. So this could be like wireless transmission of power on the lunar surface, which brings up a whole nother issue, which is how do you do that in a dusty environment? And of course, anything that happens on the lunar surface kicks up dust, as we know. So then we need new lunar coating technologies to ensure that we're keeping dust to a minimum. So there's all kinds of, I would say, technology contributors, but fundamentally everything is derivative of power. If we don't have enough power on the moon, we're not going to be able to build the infrastructure. We won't be able to do the resource extraction. We won't be able to build the mass driver that Jerry O'Neill talked about, that Elon's now working into his talking points, which I love because I'm an O'Neillian. But it's all derivative of power, Brian. I think that's the number one thing. If I was a policymaker on lunar strategy, I would really, really, really be focused on power right now. I think that's a key enabler.
Yeah, and it's again back to the discussion about connecting this back to what's going on terrestrially. We're having that discussion terrestrially, right? What does
Mhm.
the future of power look like? What are the sources? How do we have the energy we need to do all the things we want to do with data centers and other kind of power hungry things? But I think uniquely on the moon, the real question is surviving the lunar night. I'm not sure
Mhm.
everyone really understands that on the moon, right? You've got 14 days of daylight and 14 days of nighttime. And the nighttime is really, really cold. So I think that's a big part of what you're talking about, right? In terms of the power.
Exactly. Yeah, persistent power and to your point, just the harshness of the lunar night for sure. There are at the poles, I think, persistent sunlight opportunities. I think it's a narrow part of the pole, but then that becomes how do you distribute that power, right? So yeah, there's all kinds of. By the way, we can solve these problems, Brian. I'm not technologically. I don't think these are long putts, as they say, but it just requires a grand vision and smart people to sit down and kind of map it out. And I don't think there's one path to glory either. I think there's multiple paths to glory, but I do think it's not being talked about enough because without the power, as I said earlier, I'm not sure any of these infrastructure projects can happen. So I think power is definitely the limiting factor at this point.
Speaking of infrastructure, that I think prompts a question about investment. When we think of terrestrial economies, there's all these different models for how you fund big scale infrastructure development. I'm thinking of ports or
Mhm.
development authorities, those sorts of things. Do you have any thoughts on what that might look like for the moon, or what we might do to enable some of that kind of, to your three L's, kind of building out that level of infrastructure?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think it's important that we have consistent policy on this. So what would not be ideal is if in 36 months we had a new president and a new administrator and they said, hey, we want to go to Mars and not the moon, right? And you and I have seen that movie before, Brian, where it's, lunar Mars, lunar Mars. I don't think that's going to happen. I think lunar is very bipartisan at this point. I believe that. I could be wrong, and I don't know who's going to be the next president, of course. But I think that's a risk. So this consistent policy direction where investors know if they invest that there's a reasonable chance that the infrastructure projects will be completed and a return on investment will be generated. I think that's the most important thing. Think of that as market signal, if you will. The second most important thing, I think, is the government actually seeding it with R&D capital, right? Whether Space Act agreements or the like, to get at least some forward momentum. If the first point I made is Siphius with the boulder rolling back down the hill, we need forward momentum to actually get the boulder going. And then I think the third point is a promise of services contracts on the back end. So let me just take lunar power, for example. If the government were to say, look, we need a lunar power grid, and we're accepting bids on that, we think this is a priority. And I think they're doing this on nuclear, and provide an opportunity to do some Space Act agreement or seed capital for that. And make it clear that after that competition, the government will enter into a services agreement to contract for that power, either on a per use basis or to actually buy a power station, for lack of a better analogy. I think those are the kinds of things that help unlock the capital markets. Now, there still might be a plug there. I don't think it's going to be completely efficient because these are longer term timeframes. So I think it'll still be a challenge for companies to find the right capital provider. And it might not be the public markets. It might be a sovereign wealth fund that has maybe a longer term view. But I think all of these things reduce friction. So just, in summary, clear policy in terms of this is what we're going to achieve, similar to what Jerry did with Ignite, just, stay the course in terms of what that vision is. The second is, the equivalent of seed capital on these Space Act agreements or other things to get the ball rolling. And then the third is a recognition that after the technology milestones are achieved and the competition has been won by one or more providers, that there will be services agreements on the backside of that. I think that's the right model.
Going back to what you opened up with, which is, your vision of the three L's, low Earth orbit, lunar, Lagrangian. Do you think those are distinct? In other words, do we invest in LEO, or do we invest in lunar or Lagrangian, or are they more connected than people might realize?
I think they're more connected. So power applies to all three. I'll give you another example. We made a strategic investment in Max Space. Max Space does inflatable, expandable habitats. I really am bullish on the technology. It's been around for a while, as you know, Brian, but they have really, back to what I said earlier, that technology is starting to mature. They have really matured this technology. So you can imagine expandable habitat being applicable to LEO. Maybe this is attached to Starlab, our space station, as an expandable additional volume on the station. But it also is directly applicable, and I'm probably even more excited about this, for lunar habitat. Because if you look at different mechanisms to create lunar habitat, I think expandables is one of the best design parameters that you could come up with. And then similarly, if you're thinking about building an outpost at a Lagrangian point, either for data collection or experimentation or proving grounds for deep space technology, I think inflatables also apply. So, whether it's data transmission, power generation, habitation, radiation hardening, advanced electronics, all of these have applicability to all three of those L's. So I do see a roadmap where we can invest in technology, we meaning the royal we, the US and other parties, that are directly benefiting all three of those domains.
I want to return to a point you made, or the term you used, O'Neillian. I think you're referring to, kind of the three major camps in the space advocate community. Can you just explain that for the listeners who may not be familiar with that?
Yeah, so Gerard K. O'Neill was a professor at Princeton, beloved in the 70s, died too soon, unfortunately had leukemia. But he was notable because he really worked out this notion that once you're out of a gravity well, the silliest thing you could do, at least from his vantage point, is to dig yourself back into another gravity well. So his thought was to build infrastructure in free space, in these Lagrangian points and elsewhere. And his vision, which I think is a brilliant vision, I think Bezos is an O'Neillian in many respects as well, is this notion that you get heavy industry off the Earth, and ultimately the Earth becomes a national park. It becomes a Shangri-La. So heavy industry becomes off-world. People can live and work in space, and you can have anything from a space colony out at L5 to a mass driver on the moon producing resources and materials. And I think this is what Elon's talking about now, which is great. So that's really the notion of O'Neill. And so there are other camps like the Carl Sagan camp, which says humans shouldn't be in space. It should be mostly robotics, and humans should stick to their knitting here on Earth, and all of our missions really should be robotic based missions. And of course, each of these camps have their own wisdom, right? And then the third camp, which I think would be undefined, which is we actually need to go to another planet. We need to terraform another planet. This is probably best represented by Elon. We need to diversify consciousness, and the moon isn't sufficiently diverse from the Earth, because if an event happens here on the Earth, the moon's going to be impacted by that. So I think all three of these camps have their benefits, their wisdom. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think a lot of them are self-reinforcing. But I am attracted to this O'Neill vision of getting heavy industry off Earth. I think that's it's a wonderful view, I think, because I'm one of the few people who've had the opportunity to see the Earth from space, right? I did that suborbital flight, Brian, in December 21. So I've seen the Earth from space. It's a life-changing moment. And one of the things you realize is that this is a precious jewel, and it's an absolute miracle that we're here. And so when you have that sort of deep inside of you, you want to protect it. And so that's why I think I'm more of an O'Neillian than anything else.
I think it's a beautiful place to leave our conversation for today. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing us with your vision for the future.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be with you.
All right. Back to you, Colleen.
Thank you both. Let's go now to the CEO and co-founder of Varda Space Industries, Will Bruey, for his perspective on enabling the space economy for LEO. He's talking to Dr. Jen Stein. She's Director of Strategic Foresight here at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Jen?
Thanks, Colleen. And hello, Will. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for taking the time to discuss enabling the in-space economy with us. I'd just like to start out, if you could briefly introduce yourself and tell us about your company, Varda.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And great to see you, Jen. My name is Will Bruey. I'm co-founder and CEO of Varda Space Industries. And before this, I was an engineer at SpaceX and also spent some time in investment banking. And before founding Varda. What Varda is we make pharmaceuticals in microgravity of outer space because you can create formulations that would otherwise be impossible on Earth due to gravity. And then we bring them back for patients on Earth.
Very cool. Yeah, I've been reading up a lot on the work that you're doing. And as part of the Foresight team here at Aerospace, we're thinking about these possible space futures across multiple lenses, like technology, culture, economic activity, and governance and policy, of course, being part of the Policy Center. So let's imagine it's 2046. It's 20 years from now. Varda's been operating for 25 years. So what's happening in the space economy these days in 2046?
Yeah, in 2046, the space economy is going to look a lot more like the regular economy. You won't really notice a difference between the terrestrial economy and the space economy like you do today, where they're kind of bifurcated. You'll see it as kind of one big economy. The way I think our kids will think about space is kind of how people think about the ocean today, where it's this big, vast, enormous thing. But you don't think of the ocean economy versus the rest of the economy. And I think that'll be the same for space at this time.
So for Varda, how many like flights and reentries are you expecting, like on a monthly basis? What kinds of payloads? What's coming back? What are you imagining for that?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be using space in the same way that the ocean gets used in this economy, in the sense that we're capturing value that can only be found in outer space. You know, whether for the ocean, it's things like transportation, going from one country to another, or fishing and that sort of thing. For outer space, the big thing we're doing at Varda is leveraging microgravity, which is fundamentally impossible on Earth in perpetuity compared to when you're in the free fall of orbit. And so we're going to space to capture, to utilize it, and then bringing those products back. So you'll see for Varda, you'll see our vehicles go to space and back routinely, up and down on a daily cadence, just shipping to and from, like you'd be shipping to Milwaukee. And in outer space, we'll be making the pharmaceuticals that can only be made in outer space, and then of course turning right back around and bringing them back to Earth for patients here. So you'll see, shipping to space is becoming just shipping, and that will become more and more true going forward.
Cool. So, there's some regulatory and policy decisions that have to be made between sort of now and 2026 and 2046 to get to there. What do you see that's those sort of policy decisions that will be really integral into this vision for the next 20 years, that have either sort of enabled this or the sort of constrained these possibilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the good news is that I think the regulators actually want to see a happy, exciting, prosperous future as well. And so whenever I've seen, quote, constriction and regulation, it's really because of the writing legislation and regulation just takes time. And so regulators are trying to figure out how to squeeze a round peg into a square hole, because when the regulation was written, it was designed for square holes, and now we only have round pegs and that sort of thing. So the good news is that I think everyone involved, the intent is there. So anything that's constricting really is just a matter of time. You know, one of the things I say to a lot of the employees here at Varda is, when we have to deal with regulators and regulation, I say it comes with the territory. If you're going to push back the boundary of human achievement, then you have to deal with regulation, because regulators aren't going to regulate something that doesn't exist yet. So it kind of comes with the territory. That being said, since everyone around the table wants this future to exist, I see it as just a matter of time. So it really goes back to the first part of your question, I think, more of like, well, how can we make the regulation for, in 20 years from now, be suitable for the activities of 20 years from now? And what I think that looks like is really understanding that first, and like understanding a first or a few principles of what that economy looks like, and then at least keeping that long-term first principle in mind while writing the regulation. So for example, shipping the space is becoming just shipping. That is kind of the ultimate first pillar of all of this. So how should you write regulation, understanding that that launch and reentry is basically just going to be shipping? Then let's talk about while you're up there. In a very similar situation to the ocean, it's very vast. You don't really need to carve out land, but there is a real estate aspect, especially in geo, where you have satellites that can only be in a certain location. That being said, even in geo, there's still a lot of space. If you just think about how literally big the Earth is, and then recognize that space is even bigger than that, significantly. And so, but understanding what real estate things make sense and what don't. And then also understanding that the last thing about real estate is that real estate is inherently moving, which is kind of a weird thing to say. It's kind of like if you imagined your city streets were kind of just on a conveyor belt and they were constantly moving, your house was constantly moving, and kind of having that aspect in mind, where real estate is by definition dynamic, because if you're in an orbit, you're circling Earth by definition. So you're not, it's not like you're static up there. So a few of these pillars, I think would be very helpful to keep in mind, but nothing overly prescriptive, of course, because that's on the burden of the engineers like ourselves to build that future and then regulate it.
Right. And I think you've been navigating this quite a bit lately, like being on the cutting edge of what the orbital economy is in real time. You've sort of highlighted these emerging needs for policy and regulation, like in real time and in real orbit. Like I know you've had to work on the things on the fly, from a reentry perspective. And I guess when you start to imagine, like you said, you're working with microgravity, and I know there's a huge potential for pharmaceutical development and in-space manufacturing. Like I'm sure there's FDA like regulations that will come up and sort of other sort of bioethical considerations of like if something is made in space and then brought back, like you're saying, it's just shipping. But, and you're moving, like what kinds of regulations will there be in, FDA inspection or just bringing something back? Because a lot of these rules are terrestrial right now and not in space, right? So what do you think about like, how do you build a roadmap for 20 years to start to deal with what this might mean?
Yeah, well, let's take the first principles we just described and do a roadmap. So from first principles, like just think of space as Milwaukee. The most confusing thing about Varda and the concept of the space economy is the space part. If you just think of it as another place like Milwaukee, it makes a lot more sense. So we've got Milwaukee. Milwaukee's kind of weird in that there are anti-gravity machines that are possible in Milwaukee, like ovens that you can flip a switch and gravity doesn't apply in the oven. And then they have these conveyor belts cities where they everyone's kind of on a choo-choo train, like around, your train at under the Christmas tree kind of thing. But other than that, that's it. So now let's design regulation for that. So for the FAA, for example, it's actually pretty simple, right? Just treat launch and reentry the same as commercial flight. We've kind of already done that before. You can fly to Milwaukee, no big deal. Now, the reason why that doesn't exist quite yet is because again, regulators aren't going to regulate something that doesn't exist. So, they have very strict standards for what landing gear inspection looks like and for how air traffic works and that sort of thing. And that's just not necessary regulation if you don't have enough traffic to and from space to warrant the regulation. So they kind of have this one-off regulation called Part 450. That's what we use at Varda for re-entering our spacecraft. And so we have what's called an operator's license, which is basically says that as long as we do routine reentries kind of in the same way, where the analysis that we perform is valid flight to flight, then all we have to do is show the FAA that each flight is safe within that methodology. They've approved our methodology. It's kind of like them approving our calculator, and we still have to show them the answer every time, but they trust the calculator. So that's huge. That means that they can check something like that just in a few days. And so we are not bottlenecked whatsoever by the FAA. So kudos to them. It's been it hasn't always been like that. It's been a great evolving partnership, but it's, they're running faster than we are at this point. So that's great. Then now let's talk about the FDA, right? Okay, cool. The FDA actually is a little bit simple, is pretty simple, right? If you think about, all right, well, what's different about Milwaukee other than the anti-gravity ovens and the movie sitting blocks? Nothing really. So you actually don't need that much change in the FDA regulations because I'll tell you where you do and where you don't. So the majority unchanged for a few reasons. First is it's largely product controlled, right? At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is what's going into the human. And those quality inspections have to occur regardless if you use temperature or different solvents or different ingredients or different concentrations or microgravity in the process of making it. It all depends on what the output product is. And that is very well defined. And it's not like, even though we can create new formulations, like by going from an IV bag to a shot or from a pill to an inhalable, that doesn't mean that we're going to create a formulation type that has never existed yet before. And so, we can conform into whatever product we're making, whatever formulation we're making. So and then the other part that doesn't need to change is the way in which we do that, in the sense of we already, like a lot of what goes into what's called good manufacturing processes or good lab practices, GMP or GLP, we already have to do those things anyway for our aerospace standards, things like part traceability and cleanliness and making sure the humans are safe. And so a lot of those FDA regulations we've already done because they're enveloped by typical aerospace best practices for engineering. So luckily, the majority of FDA regulations do not need to change in order to introduce space drugs into the day-to-day economy. I'll tell you the one thing that we're working on with the FDA right now is answering a fundamental question of where exactly does our process start and end? So now let's look at the Milwaukee with the conveyor belt streets, right? So, okay, wait a second. This anti-gravity oven is moving. So does that technically mean that it's in transportation? Because the FDA talks about regulations for transporting drugs. Or should we just think of that as the same oven? So what? It's on a conveyor belt. We'll treat it as a stationary oven. That doesn't count as transportation, right? So that's the actual fundamental question that we're working on with the FDA right now is, should we treat our entire formulation process? Like just stepping back for a second, the way to think about Varda is you're basically loading drugs ready to be processed into a standard reactor, whether it be an anti-solvent device or a bioreactor, then launching it to space, pressing go as if you were going to push go on the oven here terrestrially. And then after the process is done, you stop the reaction, the chemical reactions that are developing those drug formulations, and you bring them back to Earth. So it is very equivalent to just having an anti-gravity oven back here. Now, does that oven include the rocket and the launch and the boat to bring the capsule back? That's the fundamental question of where the oven starts and stops, because this oven is on a conveyor belt. Does that conveyor belt mean it's transporting or not? So but again, this is kind of like a semantical exercise that we need to work on with the FDA and potentially add a little bit of regulation here or there where it's like, and the definition of transportation, doesn't include orbit or something like that, right? Or it does, and this is how you should think about space transportation, right? So there's a little bit of like conforming the regulation around this expanded envelope of the human or of this human achievement that we're accomplishing. But other than that, nothing like hard edges.
Going to be an interesting definitional time.
Yeah.
So we're going to come back to the present and looking sort of at the Earth orbital and eventual lunar economy. So Varda is one of many companies doing really interesting things in space right now and on Earth. So people have been talking about the space economy for decades. What is it about right now that makes it feel more real, or that more people are paying attention to it? What do you think is happening at this moment?
In a phrase, reusable rockets. That is like, I remember back when I was at SpaceX in the 2010s, Elon would always say, like, can you imagine if you flew across the country and they had to throw away the 737 every time? Because that's roughly the same order of magnitude of cost of a Falcon 9 if it was completely expendable. And all of a sudden, someday they were like, nah, don't need to throw it out after all. Like, we'll just reuse the plane. And all of a sudden, ticket prices go from this like crazy journey across the continent that only a few people can afford a few times a year to like, oh, like anyone in any class of America can now get on a commercial flight. So reusable rockets and the reusability of Falcon 9 and then coming up with Starship is the step function that is causing the space economy to look less like the movie Apollo 13 and more like Milwaukee.
And you mentioned that you have sort of a background in engineering, but then you moved over into investment or venture capital funding as well. So do you see this as there's the technology, which is the reusable rockets? Do you feel like the investment ecosystem has been more favorable? And is the policy and regulatory environment also helping this? What is commerce doing, if anything, to help with this sort of moment of looking towards a more robust space economy?
Yeah, so like the investor perspective, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, just like what the components that are beyond the reusable rockets. Do you see the
Yeah,
investment helping? Yeah.
totally. So, this is a multifaceted answer. It's not just one thing. I'll start with the first principles and I'll talk about the ephemeral stuff. So like the first principles is what I said. Space access has just radically changed. And because of reusable rockets. So that's the biggest difference. The second biggest difference is just technology in general now can capitalize on smaller volumes, smaller masses. Computers can get smaller and faster and therefore fit onto rockets. And so now the things you can do in space are more enabled even within a single rocket space. And now you've got more rockets, right? So that the second thing is just technology in general now can always significantly more fit into a rocket. So that's the second thing. And those are two huge aspects that are building up space. Then there's also, I'd say number three is kind of also perpetual or not perpetual, but perennial in the sense that their space is part of our culture in the sense of whether you're on the right side of the aisle or the left side of the aisle, everyone can agree that landing Neil Armstrong on the moon was top 5 coolest things that has happened in the 20th century. It has inspired a generation. Everyone loves astronauts. It's representative of like something in our DNA for exploring and achieving. The reason I like space is because my fundamental motivation in life is to push back the boundary of human achievement, and I think space is like the most physical, awesome manifestation of that abstraction. So you've got that kind of like perennial push from our culture. Those are all very real value. And if you think about like business generation, right? Like think about Varda. We are basically 2 arbitrages. One, microgravity arbitrage. It's free and ubiquitous in space and impossible on Earth. That is the ultimate business deal. Love it. And we can create chemical outcomes that no one else can in the world. We also have, I call it speed arbitrage. There's only 3 commercial reentry vehicles in the history of mankind: Varda, Boeing, and SpaceX. Varda is number 3. Ours is a lot smaller, not human rated as a reentry vehicle, but the concept of reentry we can do almost exclusively, especially in our form factor. So we are by far the cheapest way to go Mach 25, because if you wanted to go Mach 25 before Varda, you buy a dedicated rocket. That's 50 to 100 million bucks. Now, if you want a widget to go Mach 25, whether that be a new heat shield for the Air Force or a new IMU or an inertial measurement unit that you want to test, or you want to put something somewhere on the ground in 45 minutes, the fastest way to go Mach 20, or the cheapest way to go Mach 25, is to buy a Varda capsule that then buys a reusable rocket slot on a rocket with a bunch of other satellites on board at once. So you're basically getting the full re-entry hypersonic experience for the fraction of a rocket, because we're sharing the rocket. So it's kind of like, buying bus tickets and selling Uber service, and when we keep some of the profit in between. So those are the 2 fundamental arbitrages of Varda, and they're enabled because of these pillars of change that's creating this this value, and therefore that investment. One of my favorite quotes is from our board member. One of our board members, Mike Annunziata. He always says, the scarcity in this world, there is no scarcity of capital, only scarcity of good ideas. So if you have good ideas, capital will come. So investors are interested in Varda and other companies that have good ideas that are now just enabled by those fundamental pillars of reusable rockets. You can do more in space, and a everlasting hype around going to space. Now let's talk about the ephemeral. So obviously, if we just change the Varda website to be, instead of Varda Space Industries, Varda Space Industries natively powered by AI, our valuation would probably go up 20%. That's just buzzword stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, AI is going to revolutionize things, but just tagging that name to Varda would increase the valuation while at the same time producing 0 value. So there is some of that going on, but that's ephemeral, that's transitory. That always happens in every industry as things get exciting. And I'm sure some of that's happening right now. I mean, how could it not? We're about to have the largest IPO in history that's space related. So, long-winded answer, but getting back to your questions is, if you could decompose the answer into various true fundamental value creators, and then also just kind of the winds of societal like topical aspects, and the zeitgeist where it is, then you kind of can start to see the picture.
Do you think, when we think about this moment, that there is this more momentum, did it come sooner or later than you expected? Or you think it's just right? Like, were you thinking this should have happened 10 years ago, or no, this is the moment?
That's an interesting question. If you asked me that 10 years ago, I would have said it should have happened sooner. If you're asking me that now, I'm actually pleasantly surprised that it's happening, as the more mature, whatever portion of me is jaded aspect. So I would say the 20-year-old version of me would have been like, wow, it took us 20 or 16, took us 16 years to get to this point. I'd be like, wow, that took way too long. But me now, and just knowing how the world works, I'm actually pleasantly surprised we're here. But then the business/engineer in me knows that this is kind of obvious when you look at those first principles that I talked about. So to me, it's not even like, when you say this is happening, to me, it's more like, oh, just the numbers work now, right? Like the future doesn't arrive when you want it to, the future arrives when the numbers work.
So I'm going to go back a little bit to policy and ask you about that sort of acceleration or deceleration. Are there any sticking points in current U.S. government rules making that you think could accelerate your goals if they weren't sticking points?
Yeah, nothing from a FAA or FDA, all of these, like, I do believe sincerely that everyone at these regulatory agencies wants to see a prosperous future, and any inhibits is just kind of a technicality. Don't get me wrong, it's still, we have an entire reg team here. We have people dedicated to the FCC. We have dedicated to the FDA. We have dedicated to the FAA, and there's a lot of work that goes into it, and it's absolutely critical work. And like Varda would not succeed without it, and the future wouldn't be built without it because those regulations need to change. But since you specified like any sticking points, not really, not from a reg perspective. There's definitely ways that Varda could move faster if Uncle Sam was shaped a little bit differently, but I don't think it's on the regulation side. I think it's more on the kind of the funding side and the uh, on the way that like direction and decision is made, right? Like in the sense that administrations are at most 8 years long, and so it's hard to do anything with 8 years of certainty, let alone 4 years of certainty, and then right now, let alone with 2 years of certainty, right? And so business thrives in certainty, and so when there's a lack thereof, either in strategy or direction or funding cycles, then that can certainly slow things down. But no, that's not really regulation.
And what would you say they're getting right now?
What they're getting right now is I think if I had to sum it up into one thing, the regulators that we work with have a new sense of autonomy and sense of freedom that they can do things that they will not be punished for doing things. In previous years, the incentives were and the culture was, we got to say no. How do we say no effectively? Like, and that's understandable in the sense that ultimately, like the primary motivation of the FAA is to protect people, is safety, right? And as it should be, right? Like this, why there's this difference in incentives between us and that should always exist. We should always be in check in that way. Like I think it's a very healthy system. The regulation system, like for example with the FAA, since their primary goal is human safety, it is easy to just say no to everything because that is the easiest way to get to human safety. But and this isn't just with the FAA, but with regulation these days, across, I have seen a change in where people want to see change happen. Now they are in a positive way. They still, of course, the FCC has to regulate the EM spectrum. The FAA has to make sure no one gets hurt by aerospace. The FDA has to make sure no one gets hurt by drugs. But at the same time, they are starting to understand the balance of type 1 and type 2 error and being able to move with the freedom to allow type 2 error. And what I mean by that real quick as a background is like, no matter what, people are going to die. Type 1 error is you accidentally release a drug too fast and you kill people that would have not died because you put a bad drug onto the market. Type 2 error is you actually took too long to put that drug onto the market, and people that could have been saved if there was no delay died. And so no matter what, people are going to die. This got morbid real quick, but it's about minimizing that and sometimes recognizing that taking on some risk is actually more optimal to your overall goals.
Not to continue with the dark, but there are technological challenges that still do exist. Like space is hard, launch is hard. What is your highest priority? Like what technological challenges do you see? And actually, what are you kind of most excited about overcoming, to reframe that question? Like rather than a high priority, like
Yeah.
what exists there's a challenge and you're like, that's such a good challenge. I'm going to solve it and it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, there's a cool composite challenge we're working on right now that is, and then I'll break it down, is ultimately the nearest term goal of Varda in the next few years is to put the first microgravity enabled formulation into a human, not on the market quite yet, but on the clinical trials. Like I think the first time when there is a human with a name who just got shot with a drug that was enabled by microgravity, that makes it so incredibly real, that our success is ultimately inevitable because we've just shown that $2 trillion industries of aerospace and pharmaceuticals just overlapped. So that's now, like, what's the challenge to get there? There's really two. I'll break it down into two, and then you could break those down into even more. But to break it down into two, first is identifying what drug that is. So we don't make new drugs at Varda. We take drugs that already are effective to the body, and we change the formulation to have a better formulation. Like I mentioned earlier, there's shot to IV bag or pill to inhalable or that sort of thing. Or maybe introducing a formulation that unblocks a drug entirely. Either way, we're only working on drugs where we know the molecule itself, when in the human, does what we want it to do. So, but identifying which formulation it is, like right now, if I had one wish in the world, after all the things I should do to help humanity, but one selfish wish, I would want to know what is that drug. Because if we knew right now today which will be the first drug, then we could go develop the formulation right now in our lab. That does not take that long. The majority of the slowdown that we need to overcome is figuring out which drug that is. And there's a lot of things that go into figuring out which drug should go first. Things like, is there a pharmaceutical partner on the other side, right? So ultimately, we need a pharma company to take this to market, with doctors and clinical trials and all that sort of thing. We're just a formulation provider. And so what's interesting is even if you create a new, better formulation or a new, better drug, there's only, they call it top 20 pharma. There's 20 big pharma companies. It's like the 5 aerospace primes. And if none of those 20 are interested in that particular patient demographic at any given time, you might have a drug that is strictly better than anything on the market, but the margins just aren't interesting enough for any of the 20 people to take, or the 20 customers to take. So you need a partner. You also need to prove that there is a technical rationale that you can actually do it in microgravity. That one's actually easy for us because that's our specialty. But then you also got to answer a bunch of things like, does this formulation make sense to the patient? Does it make sense for downstream manufacturing? How about packaging? How about dosing? All of that stuff needs to go into, and we need to know, because you don't want to develop a drug and then all of a sudden realize once it gets to the market, it's like, we made it from an IV bag to a shot, but it turns out doctors actually prefer the IV bag because it forces the patients to come into the clinic and they want to check up on them or something like that, right? So that's the first biggest challenge, is what is that first drug, and then getting everything lined up to validate it. The second biggest challenge, of course, is designing the hardware payload to synthesize that formulation in microgravity. That part's actually easier because, again, if we knew what that drug was in that formulation, we can easily just, like, our space equipment is not that complicated, and we can easily design to a formulation once we know what it is. But we want to develop payloads and start collecting data to further inform what drug that is today. So the second part is kind of the engineering part of that. The third part, if I broke it down into a third, would be keeping up our cadence. We need to make shipping to space and back just shipping. So we're launching 4 times this year, 7 times next year, 10 times the year after that, and 12 the year after that. And so we have to deliver on those equal or more cadence than what I just described. And then below those are all the kind of the engineering challenges, but those are kind of the 3 things that there's 3 big exciting challenges that will ultimately put a space drug into a human, and by the end of the decade.
Wow. So we're on a 10-year time horizon. I love that. I think that feels like a very hopeful place to stop. I think we're at time, and I feel like that kind of, we're back to the future, but we're back to a very sort of hopeful place that Varda can help to bring us to in a sort of near-term frame. So that's really exciting. Will, thank you so much for your time today. I think this was a really exciting conversation for me. I like to hear your vision about what's going on and what you're thinking about the entire sort of orbital space economy. So thank you so much for joining our show today, and we look forward to keep an eye on what you're doing.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you. And finally, I'm excited to cap off this episode with government speaking on the frameworks in place and in planning for supporting private industry and growing the future of the in-space economy. Mr. Taylor Jordan is dual-hatted. He's director of the Department of Commerce's Office of Space Commerce within NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And he's also Assistant Secretary of Commerce at NOAA for Environmental Observation and Prediction. We bring perspectives from both Brian and Jen's conversation with industry leaders into this segment to help round out our three-part show on enabling the in-space economy. Let's hear from Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Colleen. Taylor, it's good to see you today. We previously interviewed a couple of industry CEOs on how they see the future space economy evolving, and we're very happy to have you here with us to give us the perspective from the Office of Space Commerce. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, how do you see the space economy evolving over the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, the space economy is one of the most exciting sectors of the US economy. And I think now we're at this opportunity where we're seeing theoretical things move into action. We're moving from policy into commercialization. And I think over the next 10 to 20 years, you're going to see continued growth in different technologies across the sector, whether that's in-space servicing, lunar landers, commercial space stations, asteroid mining, orbital data centers. But you're also going to see things like a continued increase into the capital flows in the markets that underpin and underline these technologies that the government relies on. Because I think at the end of the day, I want to make sure that our viewers and our listeners understand that the US capabilities are the capabilities of the commercial sector. So our continued reliance and trust in them to produce the thing that we need is critical. I think eventually you're going to see a decoupling of the space and Earth economy, where right now we work in a paradigm where we produce things in space and we sell them back to customers on Earth. I think in the future we'll see a decoupling where things that are produced in space are used for further space development. Eventually we'll see a lunar economy, a Mars economy, and more. So we're quite excited about the potential that the space economy has, and we're right smack dab in the middle of it, and we need to do everything we can to support our economy.
So you just named a couple of technologies and capabilities, but when you're thinking about what's happening with commercial space, what are some of these technologies or capabilities that you're particularly excited about?
That's a great question. And I get really excited and I get really nerdy real quick. So buckle up. So for Earth observations, that's what really gets me excited. We're talking about specific environmental observation technologies, or SBEM. Wearing my NOAA hat, we're all weather forecasting all the time, and 90% of the data that goes into a weather forecast actually comes from space and comes from our satellite systems that NOAA owns and operates. We have different technologies like microwave sounding, or infrared sounders, or radio occultation, ocean surface wind technologies. These things are actually improving our forecast capabilities, and the commercial sector has actually taken what was traditionally a traditional acquisition process that NOAA built and operated its own satellite, and we're moving into a world which we can buy these specific data sets as a service, and we're moving more and more into a data as a service paradigm. And again, this is moving away from how things have traditionally been done into a world in which we can have more flexibility and actually select the things on a much faster timeline than we traditionally used to have. And that's very exciting. And again, that's Earth observation technology, and that gets me really excited. But outside of that, I think what's exciting is everything is happening all at once. We're seeing this convergence of all these different technologies, whether it is the in-space servicing, whether it is actual lunar landers and NASA and what they're doing there, commercial space stations, they're all happening at once, and everybody is talking about it in the press, and it's fantastic to see. I think you're seeing the increasing pace of the space economy just continue to grow at a breakneck pace, and it's only going to get more. It's only going to go faster.
I think it's a really interesting point about the remote sensing and the weather. I think there's a lot of discussions about NASA leveraging industry commercial for its capabilities, or the Pentagon doing so. I don't think many people are as familiar with NOAA leveraging that. Is that a case of technologies in the commercial world that are being specifically offered for that, or are they doing something else and it turns out they're useful for weather as well?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. And while it is potentially a niche field, the environmental space-based forecasting and data sets, that is specific to the use case. So these companies actually do go out there with a very specific mindset and say, hey, I want to produce a very certain data type to improve a weather model. So we're seeing companies go out there, and yes, of course, some of them have a dual use capability, but the ones that we are really after are specific, very specific to our weather forecast. And we have our own requirements and things that we need companies to do to actually feed into our weather model to produce a meaningful improvement into the forecast. But to your question, these are very specific to weather forecasting.
In our discussions with the CEOs, one of the clearest messages we heard from them was certainty on oversight regulations of the commercial sector that would be necessary to tap into what they described as the massive capitalization potential of commercial space and bring in investors. So that gets into things about government policy, future contracts, even seed money. You know, how are those things that Department of Commerce is working on? Can you talk about some of the efforts you have in those areas?
Absolutely. And we're working diligently exactly on that. So I'll couch this question into two different sections. There's one, which is the government signal aspect, and how do we change the way that we do business in space? And what we're doing under the hood is not only showing there is sustained funding for these very important programs, but we're also going to change the policy under the hood to match the speed and pace of what the private sector needs to have the government be a stable and predictable partner into the future. We're changing things like multi-year contracting to show that task orders don't just have 3 to 6 months at a time, but can show you a stable, here's a 2 or 5 year task order that we need this data now and into the future. We're also looking at lowering hurdles on how many assets you have in orbit at a certain time to make sure that we can partner quickly with new and innovative technologies as they come online. And we're also open to having redistribution right restrictions in the case where we can protect private business while also protecting the mission of the government. In my case for NOAA, that being weather forecasting. So really, we want to change the policies under the hood that go along with the funding that is usually the flashy thing in the news that you see. So that's really important to us. And I think it matches the speed and capability that the private sector, the US economy, is actually able to provide. Now, the next bucket that I probably like to speak about is deregulation and what we're doing there. So another government signal and how we can actually unleash the innovation of the private sector in America is through deregulation. And the Office of Space Commerce, as one of the 3 largest space regulators for the US government, we are looking at doing a rewrite of our CRISPR regulations. I've tasked the office to propose an NPRM to make sure that we are staying up to date with our commercial remote sensing authorities and licenses, and ensure that we can just meet the moment, because there are more space operators than ever before, and they're actually operating and have capabilities that can improve our government mission, whether that's national security or civil space. Both of them are extremely important. The other part that I want to mention and put a plug in for is our mission authorization framework, which was in the executive order from last year. That executive order tasked the Office of Space Commerce to propose a structure for new and novel space activities, things that don't exist today. And we've heard a lot of them in the news: orbital data centers, lunar landers, asteroid mining, you name it. These things don't exist today. And the federal government actually doesn't have a pathway to yes for them. We have a pathway for Earth observations and remote sensing. We have a pathway for launch and reentry. And we have a pathway for satellite communications and spectrum, FCC, FAA, and OSC. What we don't have is a pathway to yes for things that are theoretical and don't exist. The White House tasked us with a proposal in which we have now made public and submitted to the White House, and we have solicited feedback. We have heard overwhelmingly positive comments about our proposal, and we look forward to the next steps. But really, this is exciting because it builds in this predictability that the private sector needs to be able to operate. You need that government stamp of approval that your new and novel thing is going to be able to operate and then contribute to a space economy of the future. So we're quite excited about that. And there is also an unintended positive in that in our mission authorization framework, which is also deregulatory. There is the potential, not the necessity, but the potential for some of that process to help other space regulators with some of their own authorities and processes. Like maybe we could assist the FAA in their payload review. Maybe we could assist the FCC in their orbital mitigation plans. So these things only help, they only align the federal government in our space regulations to meet the moment and unleash the American economy.
So you mentioned the relooking at the commercial space remote sensing regulations. That was a big focus in the first Trump administration, and the framework we have today was a product of that. Do you see that as a continuation of that process, or is there something specific that you're looking to change this time around?
Absolutely. So the first regulations were done in the first Trump administration, and we're looking to increase the lead time to licenses. I think we cut that down in 2020 from something like 120 days down to single digits or very close to it, and we're looking to go even further. We always want to stay ahead of the market and make sure that we are actually supporting the market and the things that they need. We're also looking at novel constructs because there are more players than ever in the licensing and the tiering system as it stands now. We want to make sure that that still works in a more crowded environment in space.
So related to that, I think the CEOs also brought up some concerns about ambiguity in ownership of space resources or things manufactured in space. And that's bigger than just US law. So how is commerce working with other countries to create a global governance framework to enable future commercial space development?
So the Office of Space Commerce does a tremendous job liaising with other countries through bilateral engagements or conferences across the world to ensure that the U.S. economy, the U.S. government, and our space economy has a voice and a seat at the table when all of those discussions are taking place. I think paramount in my mind for the office is the need for a continued level playing field internationally. I think we assist our own U.S. capabilities and private sector companies when they don't have to jump through different hoops in other countries of the world than they do at home. And I think if that level playing field is set and things are easier for them, that makes them more able to increase their manufacturing, to re-onshore, to make sure the U.S. is the flag of choice. What we don't need is our robust space companies jumping through different hoops in America versus Europe. And I think top of mind is that is the European Space Act. And we've had many conversations. We've sent white papers over to the Commission itself. And that is for this year a topic that we want to make sure that we continue to engage on, because what we don't need is a playing field that puts the U.S. Space interests at a disadvantage. And I think another point in the EU Space Act that not a lot of folks know is the way it's written today, there are actually not exemptions in place for continued partnership government to government. Like in the Space Act, NOAA does not have the ability to partner with a European meteorological agency, which we currently do now. So if that goes away, potentially our weather forecast could be damaged by the unintended consequence of a hastily designed EU Space Act.
So another aspect of that is not just, the licensing framework, but beyond that, just the overall need for coordination, deconflicting of space activities, whether that's in Earth orbit, but also future lunar activities. One of the CEOs we talked to envisioned a world where there's U.S. companies operating on the moon, perhaps in close proximity to other companies or activity of other countries. And so that speaks to some sort of ongoing way to just kind of, make sure all that kind of works together, or maybe some international standards because we're doing business globally in space. Is that also something that you're looking at from the Office of Space Commerce?
Yes. So space is inherently global, and the speed of the space economy, as we talked about, is only increasing. So the standards issue that you discussed is extremely important. As it stands now, for things like space traffic coordination and situational awareness, those are done country by country, almost regionally. There's convening bodies through the UN, but it's extremely important for the U.S. to lead in these in the future of those conversations. Obviously, today, as things happen and in orbit, we need to make sure that satellites aren't running into each other. We coordinate with other countries. We need to continue to stitch that together. But the U.S. needs to lead in this area to protect not only our national security assets, but our economy as well. And we're more powerful in developing those standards when we work hand in glove with industry to develop them in-house to figure out what is actually needed to produce a rigorous standard to protect our own assets in orbit.
So getting to the future space economy is going to involve a lot of capital investment for infrastructure. What do you see that investment coming from? Public, private, a mix of both? Are there some mechanisms you're looking to help incentivize that investment?
Absolutely. And this is actually the top priority of the Office of Space Commerce is how do we, and this is another executive order task that we're quite excited about. It's how do you find or instigate $50 billion of additional investment in the space economy. So we are looking at various mechanisms and tools in the toolkit that the Office of Space Commerce has, whether that's U.S. government coordination and putting forward to other agencies that have programs of record like DOW and NASA and state and NOAA myself on all these programs and how we change the way we do business in space. And that's moving from that traditional acquisition into a data as a service or an OTA or a firm fixed price contract. And really, how do we push the ball forward for there to be more bites at the apple for private industry to unleash their capabilities and to actually improve our own government mission success. So outside of that, we talked about international. And I think that level playing field is extremely important because it allows industry to throw out additional investment where otherwise they might have to keep that internal. I think another thing is the deregulation aspect. The more the US government can get out of the way and deregulate, I think the space economy will thrive and you'll see additional investment. And then lastly, the mission authorization piece. I believe that when the US government has a pathway to yes for these new and novel things, and I'll use orbital data centers as an example, there is private capital waiting on the sidelines to ensure that this does have a future. And I think once the Office of Space Commerce moves forward with its mission authorization certification process, you'll see that certainty and that government signal that the capital markets crave actually help unlock that investment, and we will get to that $50 billion by 2028. I think we're also looking at other options and other ideas and how can we leverage other funding opportunities within the federal government, whether that's quasi-government programs or like the Export-Import Bank or a loan program office or CHIPS. And are there subcomponents of that should be space focused because every satellite going to orbit in the next few years is going to have on-edge compute, right? And we look at opportunities to also improve the resilience of our global supply chains. So we're actively having conversations throughout the federal government on how we can best support the space economy with the tools that the government has. And that's funding, that's deregulation, that's coordination, and international level playing fields.
You know, hearing you describe all these different activities, it strikes me that you're really talking about, treating space almost kind of like we do other parts of the space of the non-space economy in terms of, the government helping support industry. Is that how you're sort of thinking about this? Are there lessons you've taken or the department's taken from the other parts of the economy and how you are looking at promoting space?
Yes. So having those conversations with my other sister bureaus within the Department of Commerce and then throughout the government writ large, we understand how important space and the space sector is now and will continue to be. I think it's on pace by 2030 to be $1 trillion industry. That's no small feat, and that's not a small sector of the US economy. So it's extremely important that we have the conversations to ensure that we are supporting the economy, the space economy, where it makes sense. And again, the government doesn't have all the tools in the toolbox that the private sector, that the capital markets have, but we can deploy funding, we can support through deregulation, we can have government signals that actually help unlock that capital, because we are stronger whenever we actually rely on the private sector for our own capabilities rather than building a bespoke, exquisite government system. The capabilities that we have are private sector capabilities.
Well, I think that's a pretty big mission for the office and for the department. But it sounds you guys have a really good plan about how to handle things. So Taylor, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. And Colleen, back over to you.
All right. Thank you to our guests for joining this special 3-part episode. We heard from private space companies doing business in LEO and cislunar arenas. We heard from government on the frameworks to support those activities. If you'd like to engage with us or our guests, follow us on social media. If you want to learn more about the promise of in-space economic activity, check out our other 6-part series on ISAM, In-Space Servicing, Assembly, and Manufacturing. We also have other series like the recent Future Forward series. We have one on Going Faster, Resilient Space, Contested Space, Space Safety, all things space. Go to csps.aerospace.org/space policy show. Thank you to Matthew Ricola, our technical director, and until next time, everyone.